Hey everyone, I'm professional photographer Ian Plant and owner of Shuttermonkeys.com, and welcome to the Photo Critique. My goal is to help you become the best photographer that you can be. And that's why I've started these regular critique sessions, to help everyone learn more about the art and craft of photography. If you'd like to submit your images, then just follow the link in the description of this video for a chance to be featured in the next Photo Critique. Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Photo Critique. In episode 1, we had about a dozen or so photos that were submitted for review, but since then, the Shuttermonkeys critique forum has been overwhelmed with dozens upon dozens of photos. And I'm very excited about the response, but unfortunately that means I'm not going to get a chance to critique every single photo. There's just too many. But I'm going to do my best to get through as many as I can. And by all means, these critiques should not be limited to me. We're building a community on Shuttermonkeys of passionate photographers, and I encourage everyone to utilize the most useful resource available there, each other. I've already noticed that many of you are leaving thoughtful and helpful comments on other people's photos, and I encourage everyone to do more of that. And that way we can all help each other become the best photographers that we can be. All right, since time is of the essence, let's dive right into the photo critique. This photo was submitted by Isabel Guerra Clark, and it's a photo of Mobius Arch in the Alabama hills of California. And I think this is a very nice photo. Obviously, the arch is very beautiful, and there's this really compelling sky with a lot of great shapes and color in it. Now, a natural arch like this is beautiful to photograph in its own right, but it's also useful as a compositional element because you can use it as a frame. But the key to successfully using a frame is to make sure that the framing element is framing something interesting. So it would have been good if you could have gotten in a little bit closer and used the frame in a more compelling way, especially if you could have found something in the background that was very interesting and used the arch to frame that subject. I noticed that there's a lot of extra space, especially on the right of the photo, so you could have gotten in quite a bit closer to the arch, and you could have filled that foreground with the arch and use the arch to frame the interesting sky in the background, or maybe some of the more interesting hills or mountains that are in the background. Right now, with the composition that you have, the arch is relatively small in the overall visual design, so by getting in closer to the arch, by making it more prominent, you can make it a more compelling part of the composition. This photo is by Philip Ziegler, and I apologize, Philip, and to anyone else if I mispronounce your name, so I'm not sure if it's Ziegler or Ziegler. I'm going to go with Ziegler. And this is a photo of Cannon Beach in Oregon. And I like this photo. There's a lot of great color, there's a lot of great scenery, and you're using some interesting shapes. You've got the curve of the tidal pool in the foreground, and luckily you had a calm day, so there's no ripples in that water, so it's reflecting the background scenery really well. But the shapes are incomplete, so you cut off the sea stack in the background a little bit on the right, and you're also not including the full curving shape of that tidal pool. If you cut off a shape at the edge of the image frame, it's going to draw the viewer's eye to that place, and that's going to take the viewer's eye out of the composition. So by going a little bit wider, you can have the complete shape in your composition, and I think that's going to be more effective. So here, I think you could have backed away a little bit. You could have gone for a wider focal length. You might have also been able to switch from vertical to horizontal format. The horizontal stretch would have given you more space on the left and the right to make sure you weren't cutting off the sea stack and you weren't cutting off any of the important parts of that curving foreground. The curve, I think, is what makes this composition more interesting than anything else. So I would have liked to have seen more of the curve in the visual design. And if you had included the entire curve, I think that would help facilitate the viewer's journey from near to far in the composition. Here's a photo from Badr al-Hattab from Kuwait. And this shows the city skyline taken at sunrise. And Badr does note that he wasn't able to get closer to find a good foreground because there was a big fence in the way. I don't know what the fence looked like, so I can't say for sure if it's something that could have been used as a compositional element. I know that when I've taken similar shots myself, for example, with this photo of the Boston skyline, I got close to this chain link fence and used the chains as a foreground element that helped make the composition more interesting. And I got really close to these chain links, even though they were relatively small, to make them larger in the composition and to make the overall composition more exciting. So I don't know if this is the sort of thing that Badr could have done when he made this photo, but it is the sort of thing that you should be on the lookout for. This next shot by Venki caught my eye, and this is of the redwood forest in Victoria, Australia. And I really like the spacing of the trees here, and I like that you can see this very prominent line that is the space in between the trees stretching from foreground to background. And the inclusion of the two hikers in the distance, I think, is very effective for two reasons. So first of all, the structure of the composition is formed by the pattern of the tree trunks. And it looks like you spent some time, Venki, moving around to find a position where the trunks were spaced out in a pleasing way, which I think is very important, because if you choose the wrong position, then all the tree trunks get bunched up and they form one single visual mass. But if you choose the right position, like you did here, you end up separating the tree trunks and creating a pattern of vertical lines, and this pattern helps provide structure to the composition. And all of these vertical lines act to push the viewer's attention deeper into the composition, and the two hikers in the distance, although they're relatively small in the composition, they're very noticeable, and they help pull the viewer's attention to that spot in the composition, making it a very important part of the visual design. Next, we have a photo from Jeff, and this is of a banyan tree in Maui, and I think this is a really beautiful tree, and I like the wide-angle perspective that Jeff used here. I think that the subject is very photogenic, and I really like that wide angle of view, but what's lacking for me is some primary visual element that really grabs the viewer's attention. So in a sense, I think what this photo needs is a stronger foreground. And one way to have done that might have been to get in closer to one of those branches that was coming out. These look like they were relatively low. If they were low enough, you could have gotten in close to one of these branches and use that as a foreground, as a leading line. So getting closer to one of the branches can make it more prominent in the composition. It'll make it look bigger, and that'll give the viewer something to grab onto visually, and it will facilitate their journey deeper into the scene. So it'll create some near-far visual tension, which we know is very effective for most landscape scenes, but it'll also make the composition a lot more relatable and more compelling for the viewer. Next, we have a shot by Robert, and it shows the Chobe River in Botswana, and there's a hippo bellowing as the sun sets in the background. And I think this is a really great moment that's been captured here. There's really great color, and I like the overall look and feel of this composition. I think there are a few things that could have been done a little bit differently to take this up to the next level. So first of all, I think there could have been a little more breathing room on the left. Another way to approach this is just to crop a little bit off the right side of the photograph. So I'm going to just go ahead and do a little bit of a crop, make it a little bit tighter. Sort of a rule of thumb that I like to use if I've got visual elements on the left and the right of my composition, I want to make sure that they both have some breathing room so that they're not touching the edge of the composition, and that the space between the object and the edge of the composition on the left is roughly the same as the space between the object and the edge of the composition on the right. So when you have, for example, with this photo, the hippos on the left are very close to the edge of the composition, and that is going to tend to attract the viewer's attention to the edge of the composition and pull the viewer's attention out of the composition. So by equalizing the space on the left and the right, you're less likely to draw the viewer out of the composition. You're more likely to keep them engaged within the center of the composition. Second of all, the hippo's head is merging a little bit with the land in the background, and because both are in silhouette, they visually merge. There's not really any visual separation between the two elements, and I think that's a bit of a problem. Now, of course, Robert, you were taking the shot in the heat of the moment, and I know that these hippos pop up suddenly and you don't have much time to react. So this is something just to keep in mind going forward, but it would have been better to have chosen a higher or lower camera position so that the hippo's head wasn't intersecting with the land in the background. So creating that visual separation is really important for this composition. If you were a little bit higher, then the hippo's head would have been against the reflection of the sunset in the water, and that would have given it visual separation from the land. If you were a little bit lower, then the hippo's head would not be against the land. It would have been against the sun setting in the background, and I think that would have been a little bit better. So getting down lower for something like this, putting the animal's head with the sun right behind it can be very effective when you're making these types of shots. So I'm going to flash a few examples of photos I've taken that are similar to this, and you can see that getting that lower perspective so that the sun is behind the animal's head is very effective. This creates a halo effect, and that bright area behind the head immediately attracts the viewer to that most important part of the composition. So Robert, if I had been there with you, I would have recommended getting as low as you possibly could to make sure that the hippo's head was against the sun, and that would take a really great shot and move it up to the next level. This photo is by David, and it shows a steam locomotive, and I like this composition overall. I think the S-curve of the track is very effective, but what I would like to have seen, David, is if you had taken a wider view. And of course, I wasn't there, so I don't know if you had gone wider, there might have been some visual elements that were distracting. But taking into account that I'm making an armchair criticism here, as a general matter, I feel like this composition is a bit tight. You got this really great S-curve, and I think that if you'd gone a little bit wider and given that S-curve a little bit more breathing room, given it more of a chance to kind of show off its full shape, then you would have had a more interesting composition. I think that a lot of photographers have a tendency to always go in really tight on the one single element that they think is most important, and I think that's really good when you're first starting out. But as you get more experience, you learn to back off and to zoom out a little bit more and to try to provide a bit more context for your subject, and also to try to make the composition more interesting and more sophisticated. Next, we have a photo by Andrew of a pier in California, and this has got a really nice starburst effect. And to get that starburst effect, you need to be pointing your camera into the sun with a wide-angle lens, and you need to use a small aperture. The smaller the aperture you use, the more pronounced the starburst effect. So a lot of people will shoot these starbursts at f/16 or f/22. Now, personally, I avoid f/22 when I'm shooting starburst effects because of something called diffraction, which is an optical defect that kicks in when you use really small apertures. And it just basically creates this loss of image quality over the entire image frame. So I usually use f/16 or f/11. You still get a pretty good starburst effect, but you don't have that diffraction limiting your overall image sharpness. In any event, I think that Andrew's use of the starburst here is really effective, and I really like the shot. The starburst immediately attracts the viewer's eye, and it makes the composition more interesting, and where the starburst is becomes the most important part of the composition. Now, there is some bright sky in the upper left, and that brightness on the edge of the image frame is going to tend to draw the viewer's attention to that spot. It's going to draw the viewer's attention to the edge of the image frame and out of the composition. So I'd be curious to know what the composition would have looked like if Andrew had swung his camera more to the right and excluded that bright sky in the upper left and instead focused his attention on the repeating pattern of diagonal lines that was created by the pier and the starburst itself. And maybe if he had gone in underneath the pier, I think he could have had a really interesting composition. It's hard for me to really know without being there, and it's hard in this photo for us to zoom in to create a crop that would show what I'm thinking about. I'll crop it a little bit, and you can see here that when we eliminate that bright sky, this becomes more about the pattern and the starburst effect itself, and the viewer's attention is no longer drawn out of the composition. So if Andrew had been in the middle of the pier, I think then he would have had all of these logs coming down on the left and the right diagonally. They would have all framed the scene. He could have excluded those bright bits of sky that are distracting, and then the starburst effect would be the icing on the cake, making this a perfect composition. This photo is by Brian, and it was taken in Costa Rica. I think this is really nice. I like how Brian used a prominent foreground shape, and I like the diagonal visual opposition of the waterfall in the upper right, and then the cascade in the foreground in the lower left. I think this gets the viewer's eye bouncing back and forth in a really nice way. But I think there is one thing I would have done differently. I noticed that there is a tree in the background that is partially obscuring the view of the waterfall. So I think I would have been tempted to press forward and move a little bit further up the stream. I noticed that in the middle left, there's some really nice cascades there. And I think from that position, Brian, you probably could have avoided having that tree blocking the view of the waterfalls. So you would have had a clean view of the waterfall. You still would have had some really nice cascades in your foreground. And that tree would have been off to the right of the waterfall, and you still could have used it as an element of your composition. So overall, I think this is a really nice composition, but I think you need to think very carefully about how a change in your position can make a nice composition even better. This photo is by Casey Glastetter, and it is McDonald Lake in Glacier National Park in the United States. And Casey asks whether the foreground leaves are a little too bright. I actually think this is a really nice composition. I like the inclusion of the foreground leaves. I like the diagonal line that's created by the shoreline that's repeated by the cloud in the sky. So I think everything comes together really nicely in this composition. As to whether the leaves are too bright or not, actually I don't think that the leaves are too bright. I think if the leaves in the foreground foreground were brighter than they are right now, it would attract the viewer's attention into that lower right corner and pull the viewer out of the composition. But I don't think they're too bright. I think maybe you can tone down that lower right-hand corner just a little bit. If you darken that or maybe add a slight vignette to the image, that'll help keep the edges of the image frame from attracting the viewer's attention. Also, I think if the middle was brighter, that would help too. Now, you can selectively brighten the middle just a little bit using an adjustment brush in Adobe Lightroom. Actually, I think the best thing you could have done is when you were in the field making this photo, you could have waited for some natural spotlighting on the mountains and the clouds in the middle part of the composition. I think natural lighting would be the most effective way of drawing the viewer's attention into the central part of the visual design. This photo shows a sunset in the Arizona desert, and this was taken by Rita. And I think this is a really nice photo. There's some great sunset color, and I think that Rita did a good job with the composition. I feel like she could have had a little bit tighter of a composition. I think that there's a little extra space on the top and the left, so we're going to crop in just a bit to show how a tighter composition would focus the viewer's attention on the most important visual elements in the scene. And to me, it's the visual relationship created by the progression of objects from near to far. So you've got the plant in the lower right, and then there's another plant right after it, and then finally you have the saguaro in the background. These three visual elements working together creates a visual progression that takes the viewer from near to far, from bottom to top, from right to left in the composition, and a tighter crop would focus the viewer's attention more on this visual progression. I actually feel that this is a pretty common thread in many of my critiques, where I feel that people have got good visual elements within their composition, but they haven't honed in enough on the important visual elements, and they're including too much extra stuff that is distracting from the effectiveness of the composition. This photo by Andrew, I think, is a good example of this. He's got some great elements within this composition. There is a beautiful sky in the background, and there is this really strong leading line that takes the viewer from near to far. So I think that Andrew definitely had the right idea here, but I feel that a tighter, more focused composition would be more effective. When you've got a really powerful visual element like the leading line here in the sandstone, I think it's a good idea to make it a stronger part of the composition by getting closer to it. So I think what Andrew really needed to do here was to focus the composition more on the line and the relationship between the line in the foreground and that peak in the background. So what I'm going to do is crop this to a vertical to show you how much more powerful the visual design gets when you exclude a lot of the blank space to the left and the right of these most important visual elements. So Andrew, I definitely think that you had the right idea here. I think that you've got a lot of good things that are going on in this composition, but you needed to get closer and you needed to clarify and tighten your composition to take these good ideas and elevate them to great. This photo was submitted by Peter, and it shows a winter morning in Yosemite National Park. You know, one thing that stands out here is that the light obviously wasn't very strong or colorful, so that's one way to improve a photo like this is to keep going back until you get that great light. Obviously, not everyone has an unlimited amount of time that they can spend in the field, so sometimes you're stuck with what you've got. I like the fact that Peter used a foreground here, and those foreground rocks definitely help establish that near-far visual connection, and that helps lead the eye deeper into the scene. But what I would encourage you to do, Peter, is to get in closer to the most interesting foreground elements and to be a bit more bold in your use of foreground. So for example, I noticed that some of these rocks are covered with some sort of grassy-like substance, and that grass is covered with a layer of frost. And I think that there's a lot of interesting patterns that are there that you could have used. So getting in closer to one of those rocks with that frosty grass on it, I think could have made for a much more interesting and compelling foreground. Also, looking for a rock that's isolated is another way of making your foregrounds more effective. So in the photo as presented, you've got some rocks in the foreground, but they're clumped up with a bunch of other rocks. So you don't have a single bold shape that emerges to anchor the composition. So what I would have done if I were there, I would have looked for one of those grassy rocks covered in frost, and I would have tried to find one that was relatively isolated so that I didn't have a bunch of other shapes bunched up with it. And that way I could create a single compelling bold shape in my foreground that serves as my visual anchor and helps facilitate the viewer's journey deeper into the composition. This next photo was submitted by Randy, and it shows the sun setting over the ocean, and this is taken in La Jolla Beach, California. What I really like about this composition is the implied triangle created by the relationship between the three primary visual elements within the scene. You've got the sun, you've got the boy in the water with the outstretched arms, and then you've got the seagull above him. So if you mentally draw a line between these three visual elements, you have a triangle. And the triangle is an effective compositional shape. Triangles help provide stability for the overall composition, but they also create a lot of visual energy because the viewer's eye wants to go to each point in the triangle, so the triangle keeps the viewer bouncing back and forth between these three primary visual elements. So I think that is very effective at creating a composition that is balanced, but at the same time has a lot of visual energy and gets the viewer's eye moving around. Speaking of compositions that are both balanced and energetic, I really like this shot taken by Brian in Nelson Lakes National Park of New Zealand. This is a symmetrical image. It's symmetrical from top to bottom and also from left to right. But I like the fact that Brian broke up the symmetry to add more visual energy. So he placed the horizon slightly above the center of the composition from bottom to top. And also the right side of the composition looks a little bit different than the left side because the right side shoreline was closer to the photographer. It's a little bit bigger than the left side of the image. So even though there's an element of symmetry in this image, which is very pleasing and makes the composition balanced, there's also visual energy. There's also these asymmetrical elements that get the eye moving around. And I think that's very effective. So when I'm making compositions, I'm often looking for a way to mix symmetry and asymmetry, balance versus imbalance, order versus chaos. If you can find the right mix, then you're going to create compositions that the viewers find pleasing, but also energetic at the same time. This photo by Jeremy is a really good example of this, and this was taken in Shenandoah National Park, which is one of my favorite stomping grounds from when I was living in the Washington, D.C. area. And what I really like about this composition is the diagonal opposition of the two primary visual elements. So in the top part of the image, you've got this one bright cloud that's catching the last light of sunset. And in the bottom part of the image, you've got this big boulder, which is the foreground. And Jeremy really effectively uses the foreground here. You can see that the two primary visual elements aren't lined up perfectly vertically. They're actually skewed. So the cloud is in the upper right. And even though the boulder fills up most of the bottom part of the image frame, it is a little bit more off to the left than it is to the right. And I think part of this is helped by the triangle that's formed by this boulder, which creates this pointy end that is pointing down into the lower left of the image frame. And as a result, you have this diagonal visual placement between the lower left boulder and the upper right cloud. And that gets the eye bouncing back and forth between these two elements. So the composition is very balanced from lower left to upper right, but it's also visually energetic. And the viewer's eye is constantly bouncing back and forth between these two opposing visual elements. Now, you may have noticed that it's a fairly common critique of mine that people are either too wide or too tight with their compositions. And finding that just right zone in between is often very difficult, and it's one of the most challenging things about becoming a better photographer. This next photo by Robert, I think, is a perfect example of getting it just right. This photo is of an elephant washing itself in the waters of the Chobe River of Botswana. And I really love this composition. It's got a lot of visual energy. Robert's captured an amazing moment here, and I love this really tight framing. He zoomed in just the perfect amount to include the most important elements of the scene. What I think really makes this composition work is the repetition of the diagonal line. So you've got the one diagonal line formed by the trunk of the elephant. And then there's this diagonal line on the right, which is actually formed by the edge of the elephant's ear. That repetition of shapes is really powerful here. And those two lines frame the most important visual elements in the composition. And one of those important elements is the elephant's eye. The eye contact that the elephant has with the viewer here is really powerful, and it is an important part of making this such a compelling photograph. And this curve formed by the waterline on the elephant goes from the elephant's trunk and it sweeps around to the edge of the ear, and then the curve of the ear takes the viewer up in a circular motion, and then that curve points back to the eye and the trunk of the elephant, which starts the visual journey all over. This effectively traps the viewer's eye within the composition and keeps the viewer's attention constantly circling through the entire visual design. And that is going to hold their interest over time. So Robert, I just wanted to let you know that this is my favorite image from this round of critiques. I can't tear my eyes away. Of course, we had many amazing photos that were submitted for this round of critiques, and here are a few that caught my eye and deserve at least an honorable mention. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to give detailed critiques for all these images, and just know know that if your image wasn't selected, it wasn't because it was bad. There's just a limit to the number that I can do in any one of these critique sessions, and hopefully we'll see more of your photos and I'll choose one of your images next time. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for submitting all of these amazing photos, and I'm looking forward to seeing more awesome images in the next photo critique. In the meantime, stay tuned for what's up next, and don't forget to subscribe to Shuttermonkeys TV on YouTube. I'm Ian Plant, and thanks for watching.